April 7, 1943. First Lieutenant James Swett was climbing through 14,000 feet over the Solomon Islands when the largest Japanese bomber strike since Pearl Harbor appeared on the horizon. He was 22 years old. It was his very first combat mission. Somewhere ahead of him, 67 Aichi dive bombers and 110 Zero fighters were descending on the Allied anchorage at Tulagi. His four-plane division of Grumman Wildcats was the outermost layer of the Allied air defense, 4 aircraft and 4 pilots between those bombers and the ships below. He had no idea of the full scale of what was coming. He had no wingman in sight. His wing was already leaking from a hole punched through it by his own side's anti-aircraft guns. And somewhere in the next few minutes, a Japanese rear gunner would shatter his windscreen, punch through his oil cooler, and send him gliding toward the water with a seizing engine and blood running into his eyes. He was 22 years old. It was his first combat mission. By the time it ended, he would have destroyed more enemy aircraft in a single flight than most fighter pilots accumulated in an entire career. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to San Mateo, California. You have to understand the boy he was before the war existed, before the Pacific was a battlefield, before any of the names in this story meant anything to anyone outside the Solomons. James Elms Swett was born on June 15, 1920, in Seattle, Washington. He was the first child of George Elms Swett and Nellie Emily Burns Swett. His father was a man who built things that had to work. He was an engineer and a Marine Corps reservist, and those two identities were not separate in the Swett household. Precision was not optional. Tolerances mattered. The difference between an engine that ran and one that seized was invisible until the moment it became catastrophic. Swett absorbed that orientation early enough that it stopped being something he thought about and became something he simply did. The family moved south to San Mateo, California, while James was still young. He attended San Mateo High School and then enrolled at the College of San Mateo in September 1939. He joined the Civilian Pilot Training Program, a federally funded initiative created to build a reserve of trained pilots in case the country ever needed them faster than the military pipeline could produce them. Most young men took the certificate and moved on. Swett stayed in the air. He flew on weekends. He flew on weekday mornings. He flew through the marine layer that burned off the California coast and through the clear afternoons that followed. By June 1941, he had a pilot's license and roughly 240 hours of flying time. By the time he walked into the Naval Reserve recruiting office and signed his name on August 26, 1941, he had accumulated well over 400 hours in the air. That was not a student working toward proficiency. That was a pilot who had already built the foundation that military training was going to extend rather than create. Growing up with a father who was both an engineer and a Marine reservist gave James an understanding of service not as an abstract obligation, but as a specific practice with its own standards. You either met those standards or you did not. There was no partial credit. He had seen that demonstrated at home long before the war gave him a chance to demonstrate it in the air. The date of his enlistment matters. August 26, 1941. The United States was not yet at war. Pearl Harbor was 102 days in the future. The Pacific was tense but technically at peace. Swett did not enlist because his country had been attacked. He enlisted because anyone paying careful attention could see that it would be, and he wanted to be ready when that happened. He reported to Naval Air Station Corpus Christi in Texas for military flight training and finished in the top 10% of his class. He was commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps Reserve on April 1, 1942, 4 months and 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor. He was 21 years old. He continued at Quantico, Virginia, for advanced tactical training, learning Marine Corps fighter doctrine, the angles and approaches and energy management that separated the men who came home from the ones who did not. He learned what the Wildcat could do and what it could not. He learned why a Wildcat pilot never tried to turn with a zero, why altitude and diving speed were the tools that kept you alive, why the dead zone below and behind an Aichi dive bomber was the place to be. Then he went to Lake Michigan for carrier qualification, landing a fighter on a moving deck repeatedly until the technique was reliable. He qualified without difficulty. By the summer of 1942, he was in California, completing the final stage of his pre-deployment preparation. In July, he was placed under arrest for 10 days. The charge read diving and zooming over traffic below 500 feet along United States Route 1. The Marine Corps filed it as a disciplinary matter. The other pilots found it entirely consistent with what they knew about Swett. He was talented, fearless, and willing to work right up against the edge of what a machine could do. That quality would define 15 minutes over Tulagi. It nearly ended him over California first. He received his orders for the South Pacific in December 1942. Marine Fighting Squadron, 221, the Fighting Falcons, part of Marine Aircraft Group, 12, 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. The squadron crossed to the South Pacific aboard the escort carrier USS Nassau and arrived at Espiritu Santo in late March 1943, then flew on to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. VMF 221 carried a particular weight of history into that deployment. It was the same squadron that had launched from Midway Atoll on June 4, 1942, to intercept the Japanese carrier strike force, sending about 24 fighters into a sky held by vastly superior numbers of Zeros. Most of the pilots who flew that mission did not come back. The squadron lost 14 pilots killed and 4 more wounded. Of the aircraft that returned, only 2 were still flyable. The squadron was rebuilt and reassigned. The men who joined it for the Guadalcanal deployment knew the name they were flying under. That history does not explain what Swett did over Tulagi, but it belongs in the same story. Henderson Field had been the central objective of 6 months of ground combat. The Japanese had tried to retake it through 3 major ground offensives across October and November 1942 and had failed at every one. They had bombarded it with warships at night, sending destroyers and cruisers down the slot between the islands to fire at the runway, the fuel dumps, and the aircraft revetments. Marine and Navy pilots had defended it flying aircraft that were frequently outnumbered, often outperformed, and almost always short of spare parts and replacement pilots. They had held it because the alternative was unthinkable. By the time Swett arrived, the ground battle was over. The Japanese had slipped away in February in destroyers under cover of darkness. What remained was a functional base, scarred and worn, smelling of tropical decay and aviation fuel. Iron Bottom Sound, the stretch of water between Guadalcanal and the islands to the north, had earned its name from the number of ships both sides had sunk there during the campaign. The Marines called it a graveyard and flew over it every day. What was next was north. The war had shifted from defensive to offensive, and Henderson Field was the staging point for the advance up the Solomon's chain toward Rabaul. Every island seized, every airstrip taken, every Japanese garrison neutralized, extended the Allied reach, and compressed the Japanese defensive perimeter. The Japanese understood this as clearly as the Americans did. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet from his headquarters at Rabaul, had spent the first 14 months of the Pacific War winning. He had planned Pearl Harbor. He had directed the destruction of Allied naval power across the opening campaigns. He had pushed Japanese expansion to its greatest extent. Then Midway had destroyed 4 irreplaceable Japanese fleet carriers in a single afternoon, and the trajectory had begun to bend. Then Guadalcanal had bled Japan for 7 months, and the bend had accelerated. By early 1943, Yamamoto was managing a strategic position that was deteriorating faster than he could stabilize it. He assembled at Rabaul, the most powerful air concentration Japan had put together since the opening of the war. He stripped the flight decks of Zuikaku, Zuiho, Hio, and Junyo of their air groups, sending experienced carrier pilots ashore to reinforce the land-based 11th Air Fleet. Combined with the forces already at Rabaul, the concentration gave him nearly 300 aircraft, including many of the most experienced surviving aviators in the Japanese Navy. The operation was called I Go. The plan was a series of concentrated strikes against Allied bases and shipping in the Solomons and New Guinea, designed to destroy Allied air power before it could be reinforced further north. IGO opened on April 1, 1943, with a fighter sweep of 58 Zeros over the Russell Islands to draw out and attrit Allied fighters. It did not produce the results Yamamoto wanted. 6 days later, he committed his full bomber force. On April 7, 1943, he sent 67 Aichi D-3, a 2 dive bombers escorted by 110 Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighters south toward Tulagi Harbor. The bombers came from the carrier air groups of Zuikaku, Zuiho, Hio, and Junyo, and from the land-based 582nd Kokutai at Rabaul. The VAL crews were veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, the Coral Sea, and Midway. This was not a scratch force. It was the concentrated remainder of Japan's first-line naval air power. What Yamamoto had not fully accounted for was the Coast Watcher network. The Allied Coast Watcher network in the Solomon Islands was one of the most consequential intelligence operations of the entire Second World War. It was built on civilians who had refused evacuation when Japan overran the island chain in 1942. Missionaries and plantation managers and government officials who had chosen to stay behind enemy lines with radio sets and codebooks. They were sheltered by Solomon Islander communities who took serious personal risk to protect them. They tracked everything that moved through their observation zones and transmitted reports that gave Allied commanders at Guadalcanal actionable intelligence hours before any threat arrived. On April 7th, the Coast Watchers on Bougainville watched 177 Japanese aircraft climb out of the fields at Kahili and Buka and tracked them south toward Guadalcanal. Their reports arrived at Henderson Field nearly 3 hours before the formation did. The base broadcast, "Condition red." Then, for the first time anyone stationed there could remember, it broadcast, "Condition very red." The phrase had not been part of the base's alert vocabulary before that morning. Something beyond ordinary scale was coming. 3 hours is not a long time in most contexts. In the context of defending an island airfield from a surprise airstrike, 3 hours was the difference between a disaster and a defense. It meant every available fighter could be fueled, armed, and in the air at altitude before the Japanese arrived. It meant pilots could be briefed on the bearing and estimated composition of the incoming force. It meant the scramble happened in order rather than in panic. The Coast Watchers on Bougainville, sheltered in the jungle by Solomon Islander communities who risked their lives to protect them, gave the Allied defenders at Henderson Field every advantage that intelligence could give. Without that warning, the 76 Allied fighters would have been catching up to the Japanese formation instead of meeting it head-on from altitude. The engagement over Tulagi on April 7, 1943, was as much a victory for the men hiding in the jungle with their radio sets as it was for the pilots in the sky. 76 Allied fighters scrambled from Henderson Field and from the Russell Islands. 36 Wildcats, 9 Corsairs, 6 P-40 Warhawks, 12 P-38 Lightnings, and 13 P-39 Airacobras. They had altitude advantage because they had been warned 3 hours early. They had everything a defender needed, except enough aircraft to match what was coming. Swett had already flown that morning. His 4-plane division had patrolled over the Russells without contact, landed, refueled, and rearmed. He was sitting in the cockpit of his Wildcat, Bureau number 12084, when the condition very red came over the radio. He started the engine and taxied for the runway. The Grumman F-4 Wildcat was not the most modern aircraft in the American inventory by April 1943. The Vought F-4U Corsair was already reaching frontline Marine squadrons and outperformed it in almost every measurable category. But VMF 221 was still flying Wildcats, and Swett knew his aircraft completely. The Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp radial engine produced 1,200 horsepower at takeoff and was one of the most reliable power plants the Americans flew in the Pacific. The 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, were among the heaviest armament any fighter in the theater carried. Where Japanese aircraft of the period used rifle caliber weapons, the 50 caliber round was nearly 3 times the diameter. A controlled burst at close range into a lightly armored dive bomber was usually decisive. What the Wildcat lacked in raw performance it compensated for in survivability. The cockpit was armored, the fuel tanks were self-sealing. The radial engine could absorb battle damage that would instantly kill a liquid-cooled power plant. It was not a glamorous aircraft. It was a durable one. Pilots who came back in Wildcats rarely called it inferior. They called it the right tool, if you knew what you were doing with it. Swett had spent months learning exactly that. The Val presented a different problem from the Zero. It was slower, less maneuverable, and built for one purpose, the dive-bombing attack. Once that attack was done, once the bomb was gone, the Val was flying level and slow over open water, a target if you could reach it before it formed up for the long return to base. Swett had been watching the Japanese formation from altitude for several minutes before he committed to his first attack pass. He had time to see how the waves were organized, where the Zeros were relative to the bombers, and where the valleys of least resistance were. He used that time. It was not instinct. It was judgment built from months of doctrine and hundreds of hours of flying that had made the doctrine his own. He climbed north with his 3 wingmen at altitude. The sky was clear and intensely blue. Below him, Tulagi harbor was already filling with smoke as the Japanese attack opened. He could see the valves below him, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable against the water, the fixed undercarriage visible even from altitude, and the noses pitching down as aircraft after aircraft rolled into its attack dive. The Aichi D-3A2 was a proven weapon. Its perforated dive flaps deployed during the attack run to limit speed and give the pilot time to aim. A trained VAL crew could put a bomb within very close range of a moving ship from altitude, and these men had been doing exactly that since Pearl Harbor. They were professional and experienced, and on this morning vastly superior in numbers. Each VAL carried a rear cockpit gunner with a flexible 7.7mm gun on a ring mount. That weapon could cover a wide arc, but had a dead zone directly below and behind the tail, where the fuselage blocked the aim. A fighter attacking from there could close to very short range before the gunner had a useful shot. That was where every Allied fighter pilot was trained to go, and it was where Swett went. He came down into the first wave from above and behind, building approach speed from altitude. The first VAL caught fire. He did not watch it fall. He shifted to the second and fired. The second burned. He shifted to the third and fired. The third went down in black smoke toward the harbor below. 3 bombers in a single pass. He pulled out at approximately 1,000 feet and flew directly into the dense anti-aircraft fire from the Allied ships below. Those guns were firing at anything airborne. At the speed and chaos of a large-scale air battle, with dozens of aircraft crossing at every angle, the gun crews were making the best decisions they could with the information they had. A round from friendly anti-aircraft fire struck Swett's wing. It destroyed his landing flaps and disabled one of his 6 guns. He had been hit by his own side before a single Japanese weapon had touched him. He had no flaps, 5 guns, and a wing with a hole in it. He climbed back through the anti-aircraft fire. His division had been scattered. He could not find his wingmen. He emerged from the barrage alone and found what he was looking for on the other side of it. A second wave of VALs had completed their attack runs and were forming up for departure, turning north for the long flight back to Bougainville. Their bombs were gone. Their fuel reserves were getting tight. The urgent focus of the attack run was behind them. The looser discipline of a departure formation had taken its place. They did not see the single Wildcat coming up from below. Swett positioned himself in the dead zone beneath the rear gunner's weapons. He closed on the first VAL. Short burst. It caught fire. He shifted and fired on the second. Down. Third. Down. Fourth. Down. 4 consecutive kills in roughly the same number of minutes, each one executed with the compressed efficiency of a man whose hands had been trained across hundreds of hours to do exactly this. He pulled up and lined the next VAL in his sights. The rear gunner of that aircraft had been watching his formation die. He was a professional. He had seen 4 aircraft fall in quick succession. He understood where the Wildcat was and what it intended to do. He held his fire as Swett closed, denying the approaching pilot the warning that an early burst would have provided. He waited until the range was almost nothing, and then he fired a sustained burst directly into the nose of the Wildcat. The windscreen shattered. Fragments of plexiglass tore through the open cockpit and cut Swett's face. The same burst punched through the lower cowling into the oil cooler just forward of the engine firewall. Swett pressed his trigger and put his last rounds into the VAL as the burst was coming in. He hit it. He watched it go down, trailing smoke. But what had just happened to his own aircraft was past correcting. Oil sprayed back from the punctured cooler across the shattered windscreen, across the instrument panel, over his hands and controls. The oil pressure gauge was falling. Without oil pressure, metal ran against metal inside the engine. The temperature climbed. The cylinders began to seize. He turned south toward Henderson Field and calculated whether the distance was possible on whatever power was left. It was not. 1 to 2 miles off Florida Island, the engine locked. The propeller stopped. The Wildcat was gliding at low altitude over open water, an aircraft with no power, a shattered windscreen, oil covering every surface inside the cockpit, and the pilot's face bleeding from the plexiglass cuts. He found a patch of water and put the aircraft down. The impact was hard enough that his face struck the gun sight, breaking his nose. The Wildcat bounced once and dove. He fought free of his harness and surfaced into Tulagi harbor with his May West inflated, blood mixing with the oil that covered him. A small craft reached him within minutes and brought him ashore. The medical staff found a broken nose, multiple windscreen lacerations, and oil ground into every wound. He was alive. His aircraft was on the harbour floor. The rear gunner who had finally stopped him had done his job with professional precision and had not survived the exchange. 7 valves had been destroyed. So had the Wildcat. The pilot was alive. The full accounting of April 7, 1943, took the rest of the day to compile. 76 Allied fighters had met the full Japanese strike force. Japan lost 12, zeros and 9 vals. The Allies lost 7 aircraft. The ships in Tulagi harbour paid heavily. USS Aaron Ward was sunk. HMNZS Moa was sunk. USS Okinawa was beached and later destroyed. But the objective of the operation, the destruction of Allied air power in the Solomons as a precondition for halting the Allied advance, had not been achieved. Japan had lost the pilots and the aircraft, and those losses compounded the ones that had come before. The ships that were sunk that morning mattered too. USS Aaron Ward had been a frontline destroyer, part of the screen protecting the anchorage. HMNZS Moa was a New Zealand corvette that had been running convoy escort across the South Pacific since the early months of the campaign. USS Okinawa was an oiler, and in a theatre where fuel was one of the most constrained logistics variables, losing an oiler had consequences that went beyond the ship itself. But Yamamoto had not sent 177 aircraft to sink 3 ships. He had sent them to break Allied air power. That objective failed completely. Among the Japanese dead was Lieutenant Tamotsu Takahata of the 582nd Kokutai, whose rear gunner, Chief Petty Officer Kazuma Komazawa, had been killed in the engagement. Takahata attempted to force land on a beach in the Solomons. Local islanders found him, killed him, and then delivered his documents to American intelligence. The papers confirmed which units had participated and helped analysts reconstruct the actual Japanese losses, which were considerably smaller than the returning crews had reported. The numbers alone do not capture what those losses meant. Replacing an aircraft was a matter of production schedules and shipping lanes. Replacing an experienced carrier pilot was something else entirely. Japan's naval aviation training pipeline had been built to produce a small number of highly skilled aviators, not a large number of adequately trained ones. The men flying vals and zeros over Tulagi on April 7 had taken years to develop. They had learned their trade in China, in the opening Pacific campaigns, in 14 months of sustained combat. Each one who did not come back represented a gap that could not be filled on any schedule that matched the pace the war was now moving at. The Americans were producing replacement pilots by the thousands. Japan was not. That asymmetry was invisible in any single engagement and decisive across the whole arc of the war. Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, serving in April 1943 as Commander Aircraft Solomons, had commanded USS Hornet at Midway the previous June. He understood what the loss of experienced carrier aviation personnel meant for Japan's ability to sustain a long war. When the April 7 after-action reports reached him and described what Swett had done in 15 minutes over Tulagi, Mitcher submitted the Medal of Honor nomination from his headquarters before Swett was medically cleared. The nomination moved through a chain of command that reviewed the evidence at each level and approved it without obstruction. The medal was presented on October 10, 1943, at Espiritu Santo by Major General Ralph J. Mitchell, Commanding General of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. 6 months from action to medal, no delay, no denial, no decades in an archive. The recognition was swift and uncontested, and that is worth saying plainly because it was not always the case for men who had earned it just as clearly. Think for a moment about what the scene looked like from the men on the ships in Tulagi harbour that morning. They were looking up at a sky that had filled in minutes with 177 Japanese aircraft. They could see the vals rolling into their dives, the steep descents ending in bomb releases at low altitude, and they were firing everything they had at anything that moved above them. Every gun on every ship firing simultaneously into a crowded sky at combat speeds. In that environment, the round from friendly anti-aircraft fire that struck Swett's wing was not negligence. It was the mathematical inevitability of dozens of weapons firing blind into chaos. The same fire that crippled his aircraft had also driven away Japanese aircraft that might have made his second attack impossible. The chaos that nearly killed him was the same chaos that kept him alive long enough to continue the fight. The men on those ships watched what happened next from below. They saw a single Wildcat emerge from the anti-aircraft barrage and turn north toward the departing Japanese formation. They saw the valves begin to fall. They could not have known in the moment that the pilot of that aircraft had already been hit by their own guns and was flying with no flaps and 5 of his 6 weapons. What they saw was a fighter attacking a formation of bombers with complete aggression, methodical and relentless, not breaking off, not searching for a way out. They would talk about it afterward in the way men talk about something they watched carefully because they could not look away. He returned to combat. He transitioned to the Vought F-4U Corsair as VMF 221, re-equipped with newer aircraft. He was promoted to captain on May 31, 1943. On June 30, covering the Allied landings at Rendover during the New Georgia campaign, he shot down 2 G-4M Betty bombers and shared credit on a 0. His total climbed. What is easy to lose in the tally of kills and dates is the pattern underneath them. Swett was shot down twice in this war, once at Tulagi in April and once at Kula Gulf in July. Both times he went back to combat as soon as he was physically able. That is not something every pilot did. Some men who went through what he went through in April 1943 came back quieter, more cautious, and more aware of how thin the margin was. Swett came back flying the same way he had always flown. The experience did not subtract from him, it seemed to add. Each engagement, each recovery, each return to the cockpit deepened the foundation of judgment that had been there since before the war started. By the time he completed his first Pacific tour with 15.5 confirmed victories, he was not the same 22-year-old who had climbed out of Tulagi Harbor. He was something harder and more precise, a pilot who had been tested at the highest level and had not been found wanting. On July 11, 1943, over Kula Gulf near New Georgia, he shot down a Betty and a 0 before Japanese fighters hit his aircraft and forced him into the ocean a second time. He went down into the water near New Georgia and was quickly reached by Solomon Islanders in a canoe, who pulled him aboard and paddled for hours to the nearest Australian coast watcher's position. A flying boat picked him up and returned him to the Russells. He was back in the fight within days. That is how a man gets rescued in the Solomons in 1943, not through luck alone, but through a network of islanders and coast watchers who kept Allied pilots alive long enough to matter. Over Kahili in October 1943, he added another 0. In November, 2 vals fell to him over Bougainville. By the close of his first Pacific tour, his confirmed total stood at 15.5 victories with 4 probables, accumulated across 103 combat missions. He came home in early 1944. He married Lois Aileen Anderson on January 22, 1944, at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Burlingame, California. They had 2 sons, James Jr. and John, and both became Marine officers. The line ran from the engineer and Marine reservist in San Mateo through the Medal of Honor to the next generation. It did not require any grand speeches to sustain itself. He commanded a training squadron at Marine Corps Air Station, Santa Barbara, passing on what he had learned over the Solomons to the next class of Marine fighter pilots. Then he deployed again. His second Pacific tour placed him aboard USS Bunker Hill as part of the carrier task forces conducting the final campaigns against Japan. He flew strikes against the Japanese home islands themselves. He flew cover over Iwo Jima. He flew combat air patrol over Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, and also its bloodiest. The kamikaze threat was at its peak during that campaign. Japanese pilots flew their aircraft into American ships, not as a tactic of last resort, but as deliberate policy, a calculated attempt to inflict casualties severe enough to make an invasion of the home islands politically impossible. Swett flew combat air patrol over the fleet through weeks of those attacks, intercepting what he could, watching what he could not stop reach the ships below. On May 11, 1945, he shot down a Yokosuka dive bomber, making a kamikaze approach on the fleet. Then 2 more Japanese aircraft reached Bunker Hill before the combat air patrol could stop them. One struck the flight deck. The second dove into the ship, and its bomb penetrated below to the pilot's ready room, killing 22 officers of Navy Fighter Squadron, VF-84, part of the carrier air group embarked aboard Bunker Hill. 396 men died on that ship that day, including 43 who were never recovered. Swett was airborne on combat air patrol when it happened. He organized the remaining VMF 221 aircraft still in the air and led them to USS Enterprise, where they set down on a stranger's deck. Japan surrendered in August 1945. His confirmed total was 15.5 victories and 4 probables across 103 combat missions in 2 Pacific tours. He was 25 years old. He had been shot down twice. He had watched his carrier burn below him. He had come home every time. The Korean War began in 1950. He expected orders that did not come. His squadron deployed to Korea, but he was left behind. The command decision was plain. Sending a Medal of Honor recipient back into combat carried a risk that was considered unacceptable. He accepted it. He had done more than most men are asked to do once in a lifetime. He was 29 years old when that decision was made, which meant he had packed everything this story has described into 8 years of adult life. He was precise about that, the same way his father had been precise about everything. He accepted the decision and served out his remaining years in uniform with the same standard he had always held himself to. He retired from the Marine Corps as a colonel in 1970. The years after the war, the ones that stretched from 1945 to 1970, were not empty. He flew for the Marines through the early post-war reorganization, through the rebuilding of the service after demobilization, through the years when the jets came in and the piston engine fighters he had flown in the Pacific became museum pieces. He watched the aircraft he had trained in become obsolete within a decade of the war's end. He adapted. He flew jets. He taught. He administered. He was exactly what the Marine Corps needed during a period of transition. A man who had flown the old aircraft at the highest possible level and understood from experience what the new generation of pilots was being asked to do. When the Marine Corps finally let him go in 1970, he had served 28 years. He left the same way he had served, without fanfare, having done what needed doing. He took over his father's marine pump and turbine manufacturing company in San Francisco and ran it for 23 years. He managed it with the same conviction that had shaped him from childhood, that things had to work correctly, or they were not finished. He retired to Trinity Center in the mountains of Northern California, where the local General Aviation Airport bears his name. He moved to Redding in 2007. He died of heart failure on January 18, 2009. He was 88 years old. He is buried at the Northern California Veterans Cemetery in Igo, California. His Wildcat, Bureau number 12084, rests in shallow water off Gavutu Island in the Solomons. It was tentatively identified in 2011 by researcher Ewan Stevenson, who had spent years tracing the positions of aircraft lost during the Guadalcanal campaign. The propeller is still attached. The landing gear is visible on the seabed. It has been down there for more than 80 years, pending final archaeological confirmation that it is the aircraft Swett flew on April 7, 1943. Now place the personal story in its larger frame, because the events of that morning did not end in Tulagi harbor. He announced to Tokyo that the operation had succeeded. He had consumed most of his carrier air group's best-trained personnel in a 16-day campaign that sank a destroyer, a corvette, and an oiler, and killed a handful of Allied aircraft. In exchange, he had lost aircraft and pilots he could not replace. The claim of success was based entirely on the inflated reporting his crews brought back, a problem that had plagued Japanese Air Force accounting throughout the war. The returning pilots believed their claims. They were not lying. They were flying through smoke and chaos at high speed and reporting what they thought they had seen. The problem was systemic, not personal, but the consequence was strategic. Yamamoto made his decisions on the basis of numbers that bore no relationship to reality. Yamamoto ended Operation Igo on April 16, 1943. He believed, on the basis of exaggerated reports from returning crews, that the strikes had achieved their objectives. The actual Allied losses were a fraction of what his pilots claimed. The actual Japanese losses, inexperienced personnel and irreplaceable aircraft, were severe. The carrier air groups Japan had stripped from its fleet for the operation were unavailable when Japan's carriers needed them in the great battles still ahead. In June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier aviation had been so depleted in experienced personnel that American pilots called the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The men who should have made it competitive were gone. Expended in operations like Igo against a defensive line, the Allies had no intention of abandoning. 11 days after Swett climbed out of the water off Florida Island, Yamamoto flew south from Rabaul on a personal inspection tour. American signals intelligence had decoded Japanese communications, describing his itinerary in precise detail, departure times, route, escort aircraft, and arrival schedule at each stop. The intercept was elevated to the highest levels of command, and an interception mission was authorized. 16p. 38. Lightnings from the 300, 39th, 12th, and 70th. Fighter squadrons of the 347th Fighter Group flew from Guadalcanal in a low-level, radio-silent approach of roughly 400 miles and intercepted Yamamoto's aircraft over Bougainville on April 18, 1943. His transport crashed in the jungle. He was found still strapped in his seat, his white-gloved hand on the hilt of his sword. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the commander who had assembled the force that Swett flew into 11 days earlier, was dead before the month was out. The effect on Japanese strategic planning was significant. The officers who replaced Yamamoto understood the same arithmetic he had understood. Japan was losing the attrition war. The industrial gap was widening. The trained manpower being expended could not be replaced. What they lacked was Yamamoto's combination of strategic vision and personal authority, the qualities that might have allowed him to argue for a negotiated end before the devastation of 1944 and 1945. With him gone, Japan's military leadership moved instead toward the doctrine of decisive battle and homeland defense that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides before the final surrender. The two events, Swett's engagement on April 7th and Yamamoto's death on April 18, bracket the moment when the strategic air balance in the South Pacific passed permanently to the Allies. It did not happen in any single engagement. It happened in the accumulation of losses that Japan could not replace, and every engagement, including the 15-minute fight over Tulagi, contributed to that accumulation. The question Swett himself was asked in every interview he gave over the following decades was some version of the same thing. What were you thinking out there? What went through your mind in those 15 minutes? His answer, documented in his interview for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, was characteristically practical. He was thinking about the next target. He was thinking about his ammunition. He was thinking about the angle, the larger questions about courage and sacrifice, and what any of it meant. Those were not questions he was asking in the moment. In the moment, there was a target, and there was a trigger, and there was the next target after that. That answer is either the most honest thing a combat pilot ever said or the most revealing, and it may be both at once. The men who perform extraordinary acts under pressure rarely describe the experience in the language that gets used to honor it afterward. The language of honor is retrospective. The act itself, at the moment it happens, is usually just the next thing that needed to be done. What remains at the center of the story, when all the context has been laid out, is that decision made alone. After the first pass, with his formation scattered and his flaps gone and his wing damaged, there was nothing institutional telling Swett what to do. No commanding officer in radio contact, no wingman to follow. The doctrine had given him the attack vectors, and then the situation had outrun the doctrine. What was left was a 22-year-old pilot in a damaged aircraft over a burning harbor, deciding whether the work was finished. He decided it was not. There is no record of what Swett said to himself in that moment. No radio transcript, no post-flight notes, no account from a wingman because there was no wingman. There is only the outcome. A damaged aircraft turning north, back into the fight, and the 7 aircraft that did not make it back to Bougainville because of what happened next. Every hour of flying he had put in before the war, every test he had passed in training, every standard his father had held him to about things that had to work, all of it converged on that single decision. The decision that medals and citations try to describe in formal language and cannot quite capture, because the formal language is always written afterward, and the decision was made in the middle of everything. 7 vals destroyed. 1 first combat mission, a face full of glass, oil over everything, an alive pilot treading water in Tulagi harbor. That is the story. Most people have never heard it. That is what this channel exists to change. Hit that like button right now. Not for an algorithm, for the 22-year-old who turned his damaged aircraft back toward the enemy on his first combat mission because the work was not finished. Every like sends this story to one more person who should know it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we go through Medal of Honor citations, official after-action reports, and historical records to find the men whose stories are sitting in archives while the world moves on. We pull them out and tell them. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served. Give us their name, their branch, and their era. This comment section is a roll call, and every name in it matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. And thank you for making sure that one more person today knows who James Swett was.